I now want to talk about remediating a potentially compromised S3 bucket. So what if guard duty generates any of the S3 protection finding types? Your Amazon S3 bucket might be compromised. Let's have a look at our guard duty samples. So here we have a few S3 samples where we have certain behavior detected that we need to investigate. So we have here a finding on our example bucket 4, and an IAM entity has changed the bucket policy. We then have to identify what is the IAM user or role that generated this finding, and was this legit? So in this case, we have an instance ID, we have an IAM profile. In this case, we will need to look at this instance profile that is attached to an EC2 to see whether this IAM user is maybe compromised and what the impact is going to be. So we identified the finding, we found out the associated S3 bucket, and we also see the owner. Then secondly, we identified the source of the suspicious activity and the API call used. So the API call will be listed as API. So here under actions, we'll see an ALS API call. So this is just an example generated findings API name. Here's where the API will go. And then it says either access denied or maybe it was allowed. And depending on the type, on the source type, remote IP address or source domain will give you some extra information. So in our case, it was an IAM role. So we need to identify the call source and whether it was authorized. We need to consider if an IAM user was involved, maybe the credentials were leaked. So maybe the user itself was compromised. Maybe it was not directly from the EC2 or by the user itself that the API call was invoked. Maybe the action was invoked externally after the credentials were leaked. When the credentials are leaked, we need to remediate compromised ALS credentials, which I have been talking about in a separate lecture. So if it's a user, you might just disable the credentials. If it's a role, you cannot disable the credentials. So you might take away the role from an EC2 and revoke any active session. So the question you have to be asking as well is whether does this source, this user or role, does it need permissions for this operation? Maybe it doesn't need the permissions to change something on the S3 bucket. Maybe it only needed to write and read objects. So maybe the permissions can be further restricted. A mistake that is often made is the S3 star action on allow instead of specifying only the calls that you need. For example, if you only need to read, you only need the get calls. If you need to write, you need the put calls. You don't need S3 star on the whole bucket because that will allow you to make configuration changes as well. There's also a possibility that the username comes from anonymous, and that means that the bucket was publicly accessed. So then the question you should ask is, should the bucket be public? It should really be an edge case to have a public S3 bucket. So ideally, you deny the creation of public S3 buckets. So there's a setting to deny access to all S3 buckets within an account. So here in S3, you have block public access for this account, and then you can block all public access on the account level. So you can do the same on a S3 bucket level, but also on account level, and then you cannot have any public S3 buckets. And that's actually best practice to not have any public buckets. If you still want to make certain objects public, you can always put CloudFront in front of it, or route the calls to an application, and the application will then have an ALS access key to get the correct objects. And then the last one is about the CORS policy. So if you are using CORS, check whether you have it properly configured, but also, do you really need to have a CORS policy? Do you really need to have it public? And that's again pointing to this previous line where it's better to have non-public access. So to summarize, you want to know whether it comes from a user or a role, you want to remediate, you want to block access using the ALS access credentials, or make sure that the role cannot be used anymore by maybe deleting some permissions, potentially revoking active sessions, and making sure that you are using best practices by not setting a bucket publicly. Then what is going to be the impact? Does this S3 bucket contain sensitive data? You can use Amazon Macy to determine whether an S3 bucket contains sensitive data. So Amazon Macy is not a service, just like GuardDuty, an Amazon service, but this service will look into S3 buckets, analyze it, and see if there is any sensitive data. So you basically just create a job. You can then select a specific bucket and then have it scanned for identifiable information. So if I just take one of my CloudTrail buckets, for example, then I can choose whether it's daily or just a one-time job. If I think it is compromised and I want to see whether it has actually sensitive information, and then I can use a data identifier. So Amazon has a list of data identifiers. For example, it can scan for AWS credentials. It can scan for text identification numbers in the US passport numbers. So you will actually first have to have a look at this list, whether it makes sense to you. Because if you are in a country that is not listed and you have different personal identifiable information, then these data categories will not work for you. You can still select custom managed identifiers, but even then you will have to make sure that this makes sense for you. Credit card numbers or credit card expiration is very widely used worldwide, so this might be one. But also, again, AWS credentials is also a general one. So you will have to go through this list and see if that makes sense for you. You will have to then finish the wizard. It will give you a price, what it will cost to scan it. And then once it's finished, there's findings by bucket, where you can then see, again, low, medium, high severity. I did some scanning myself of 4 resources, 4 buckets, which I did 20 minutes ago. But when I have a look at the findings, there are actually no findings. So there's no sensitive data in there, which was to be expected. So then if the access was authorized, you can ignore the finding. If you determine that your S3 data has been exposed, if it was not authorized, then you can review the following S3 recommendations to tighten permissions and restrict access. So these are some general recommendations. So I would recommend you to know these and apply these, because these are just general things that you need to know how to protect your S3 bucket. The first one I already explained, S3 block public access. So you have it on account level, but also on a bucket level. So if you have public S3 buckets in your account, you can do it on a bucket level. Ideally, you do it on account level. AWS access policies can be used to control IAM users and access. Let's have a look at one of our buckets. I have my bucket. When I go to permissions, I actually have a bucket policy. So the bucket policy in JSON can allow IAM users to access your bucket. So I have no policy here, but you could make a policy. Additionally, you can use virtual private cloud endpoints, and those can also have policies to restrict access to specific VPC endpoints. So that's on a VPC level. So on a VPC level, you have endpoints. You can create an endpoint for a specific AWS service. You have a list of Amazon services where you can create an endpoint for. So when you are in your VPC and you, for example, access S3, then it will use a public IP address, a public Amazon IP address. But if you create an interface, then you will have an interface for S3 that you can connect to that has an IP address from your VPC. So the traffic stays within your VPC. Every endpoint costs money, so it's going to depend on what security level you want to see if this makes sense. This can enhance security, so bigger organizations will actually use this. You will then specify the VPC that you want to use it for. You can enable a DNS name so that when you make a request to the default public endpoint, then it will actually resolve to the internal IP address. You specify the subnets, but then what I wanted to show you is here the policy. So you have a VPC endpoint policy. You either have full access or a custom policy. And this is again a policy in JSON format that you can define to then restrict access to this endpoint. And then what you would do in the bucket policy is that you can deny then all access that doesn't go over the VPC endpoint. So this is another way to enhance security. There's also pre-signed URLs that you can use through S3. So if you have a look at pre-signed URLs, using pre-signed URLs grant time limit access to S3 objects, to download, to upload. Anyone can create a pre-signed URL. How long these URLs are valid are listed here. So it depends who is creating it, how long it is valid. It is definitely something to be aware of, that this is possible, because this can be used then to upload or download objects by just knowing this pre-signed URL through S3. This pre-signed URL still needs to be created though, so there's then a user or a role that creates this URL, and then this URL can then be passed to a browser, for example, that then can make an upload. But this URL could also leak potentially, and this could actually be how you are experiencing a breach. The documentation is also saying that you can use S3 access points if you want to share S3 objects between different sources. I think this one is a less common one. And then to securely grant access to your S3 resources, you also have ACLs. Let's have a look at these ACLs. So it's an alternative to using bucket policies and user policies. But by default, if you now would create an S3 bucket, it's not going to use ACLs anymore. So if you have managing access with ACLs, if you have a look there, a majority of modern use cases in Amazon S3 no longer require the use of ACLs. We recommend that you keep ACLs disabled except in unusual circumstances, where you need to control access for each object individually. In general, bucket policy should be the way to go. Let's here the bucket policy. You shouldn't be using the ACLs, and they are now turned off by default when you create a new bucket. Here's the bucket policy, and here's the access control list. So these are still enabled because it's an old S3 account. But in general, you should use the bucket policy, which is recommended. And then lastly, there's some more information about S3 security options, the best practices. This one is a good one to read through. So the first one is disable access control list, what I just mentioned. And then there are some other best practices that you should be applying.